My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video and write a comment, and we begin. My parents, bless their cotton-picking souls, had always had let's call it a peculiar way of showing their love. Picture one of those Norman Rockwell paintings, but with a generous dollop of passive-aggressive sprinkles. Growing up, it was a constant barrage of thinly veiled comparisons. Sarah, darling, why can't you be more like Brittany? She always looks so put together, so effortlessly graceful. Or, honestly, Sarah, Brittany has her finances under control like a seasoned CFO. When are you going to start thinking about retirement? Ethan, my older brother, was the sun in their carefully curated universe. Everything he touched turned to gold, or at least, that's how they saw it. If he got a B+ on a test, it was because the teacher was biased. If he crashed the car, it was the other driver's fault. He was their precious, their perfect Ethan. And Brittany, well, she just amplified it. She was perfect on paper. Picture a Barbie doll who'd somehow aced a business degree and had a knack for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. Blonde hair that always looked freshly blown out, an unnervingly cheerful disposition, and a wardrobe that could bankrupt a small nation. So imagine my surprise and, frankly, my simmering years in the making resentment when my parents summoned me over for a family meeting. As soon as I walked through their perfectly manicured front yard and saw Ethan's BMW parked next to Brittany's pristine white SUV, I knew this wasn't going to be a casual Sunday lunch. This was going to be a disaster wrapped in a pastel-colored bow. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, immediately assaulted by the scent of potpourri and freshly baked cookies, a deceptive facade of domestic bliss. Ethan and Brittany were already seated in the living room, perched on the edge of the plush sofa, looking sickeningly smug. Brittany offered me one of her usual saccharine smiles, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Ethan simply nodded, his expression a mixture of condescension and pity. I wanted to roll my eyes, but I knew better than to provoke them before I even knew what was going on. Sarah, darling, Mom started, her voice dripping with that faux sweetness she reserved for awkward situations, the kind where she knew she was about to deliver some devastating news. We have a wonderful opportunity for you. Those words were like a starting pistol for my anxiety. Opportunity in my family's vocabulary usually translated to inconvenience for Sarah, massive benefit for Ethan. I gripped my purse a little tighter. Dad cleared his throat, joining the performance. Ethan and Brittany are having a bit of a challenge getting into the housing market, dear. He said this like they were facing some insurmountable obstacle, like climbing Mount Everest barefoot. My heart sank into my slightly worn but comfortable shoes. Okay, I replied cautiously, trying to decipher their carefully chosen words. What could this possibly have to do with me? Mom exchanged a meaningful glance with Dad, then turned back to me, her eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of guilt and excitement. So, we've decided to gift them your house. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The kind of silence that made the buzzing of the fluorescent lights sound deafening. My house. My house. The one I'd scrimped and saved for, the one I'd poured $75,000 of my hard-earned money into over the last few years, fixing it up, painting the walls in colors I chose, making it mine. The first real investment I'd ever made in myself. My house. I finally managed to choke out, the words barely audible above the pounding of my heart. Brittany gave me that saccharine smile again, this time with an added layer of patronizing sympathy. It's really for the best, Sarah. We need it so much more than you do, honey. We're trying to start a family, and it's just so unfair the way the economy is at the moment. You know. Ethan nodded in agreement, his expression carefully calibrated to convey just the right amount of concern and gratitude. Plus, the neighborhood has such good schools. We have to think about our future children. You'll land on your feet. But we are forever grateful. Brittany added, like I should be thanking them for robbing me. But where am I supposed to live? I asked, the words barely a whisper. I felt numb, like I'd been hit by a truck. All the years of saving and hard work had been erased in a single, casual sentence. Mom patted my hand, her diamond rings sparkling under the chandelier. Oh, don't you worry your pretty little head. We're offering you the cabin. It's perfectly charming, and it's much more manageable for a single girl like yourself. The cabin. My parents' dilapidated, bug-infested cabin in the middle of nowhere, a place that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. A place where cell service went to die, and the only neighbors were bears, squirrels, and the occasional gun-toting recluse. A place that smelled perpetually of damp wood and regret. This was their wonderful opportunity? This was their grand solution? I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I just nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. I knew arguing was pointless. They'd already made up their minds. And frankly, I just wanted to get out of there, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their warped reality. "Thank you," I mumbled, rising to my feet. "I appreciate the offer." I barely made it to my car before the tears started to fall. As I drove away, I could see Ethan and Brittany through the living room window, raising their glasses in a toast. They looked like royalty, celebrating their victory. And I felt like a peasant, banished to the wilderness, stripped of everything I'd worked for. And I couldn't stop thinking there had to be something more to this. There was no reason to give my house away, not without some incentive. The move was every bit as soul-crushing as I'd anticipated. It was like watching my life get packed into cardboard boxes, each one a painful reminder of my misplaced trust and my parents' blatant favoritism. Ethan and Brittany, predictably, were practically giddy, flitting around my house, already discussing paint colors and granite countertops. Brittany had even pinned a dream kitchen inspiration board to the fridge, featuring photos of kitchens that probably cost more than my entire net worth. I tried to maintain a semblance of composure, forcing a tight smile whenever they asked helpful questions like, "Are you sure you don't want to leave us that rug? It'll totally clash with our aesthetic," or "Do you think we should knock down this wall to make a breakfast nook?" I wanted to scream, to rip the inspiration board to shreds and remind them that this was my home, the one I'd painstakingly chosen and lovingly restored. But I bit my tongue, knowing it would only fuel their self-satisfied glee. The cabin, when I finally arrived, was exactly as horrific as I remembered. Maybe even worse. It was a squat, lopsided structure swallowed by the encroaching forest, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood, mold, and something vaguely reminiscent of dead squirrels. Cobwebs, the size of my hand, draped across every corner, and dust motes danced in the faint sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. It was the kind of place that horror movies used as a setting, a place where bad things happened. The plumbing was a symphony of gurgling and groaning, threatening to erupt in a geyser of rusty water at any moment. The only heating source was a rickety old wood stove that looked like it had been salvaged from a shipwreck. I stared at it with a mixture of apprehension and dread. I hadn't chopped wood since summer camp, and I was pretty sure I was more likely to chop off a limb than start a fire. But I was determined to make the best of it, to prove to myself, and maybe secretly to my parents, that I could survive this. I spent the first few days scrubbing, cleaning, and airing out the cabin, battling against the ingrained grime and the persistent smell of decay. I felt like I was fighting a losing battle, but I refused to give up. Miraculously, I managed to get the internet hooked up, a minor victory in the face of overwhelming adversity. At least I could stream some Netflix and pretend I wasn't completely isolated in the middle of nowhere. As I started to settle in, a nagging sense of unease began to creep in. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. A loose floorboard under the old, threadbare rug in the living room, one that creaked ominously whenever I stepped on it. A strange scratching sound in the walls at night, like tiny claws scrabbling for purchase. I initially dismissed them as the quirks of an old house, the sounds of nature reclaiming its territory. But then there were the other things, the things that couldn't be so easily explained away. One morning, I found a muddy footprint on the porch, even though it hadn't rained in days. It was a large footprint, too big to be a squirrel or a raccoon. Another time, while hanging laundry on the line, I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the woods, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and shadowy darting between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by cabin fever and a healthy dose of paranoia. And then there was the smell. A faint, metallic odor that seemed to come and go, clinging to the air like a ghost. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was always there, lurking beneath the musty scent of the cabin. It made my stomach churn and my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it all, to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was simply being overly sensitive, that the isolation was getting to me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being constantly scrutinized by unseen eyes. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, and it was watching me, waiting for something. I started locking all the doors and windows at night, even though it was probably pointless. If something wanted to get in, it would find a way. I would turn off the lights earlier than usual. The idea of being watched was terrifying. I tried to talk to my parents about it, to voice my growing unease and the inexplicable things I was experiencing at the cabin. But predictably, they dismissed my concerns with a wave of their manicured hands. "It's just the woods, Sarah. You're being dramatic," Mom said, rolling her eyes as if I was some hysterical teenager exaggerating a minor inconvenience. "Honestly, dear, you need to get out more and meet some people. You're letting your imagination run wild." Dad just patted my hand and mumbled something about fresh air being good for my constitution. Ethan and Brittany, of course, were too engrossed in planning their lavish housewarming party to even acknowledge my existence. They were hosting a rustic chic-themed soiree, complete with a live band, a gourmet food truck, and a signature cocktail named after themselves, the Ethan and Brittany Bliss. It was sickeningly ironic, considering the bliss was built on my misery. Frustrated, dismissed, and increasingly unnerved, I realized I was on my own. If I wanted to understand what was happening at the cabin, I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't rely on my parents, who were too blinded by their love for Ethan and Brittany to see anything clearly. I started researching the history of the cabin, determined to find some logical explanation for the strange occurrences. I spent hours poring over old county records, squinting at faded documents and handwritten deeds. I visited the local library, a small, unassuming building that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories, and spent days sifting through microfiche archives and dusty local history books. The librarian, a kind old woman with a penchant for gossip, seemed intrigued by my inquiry, but offered little more than vague anecdotes about the area's colorful past. It was a tedious process, filled with dead ends and false leads. But I was persistent, driven by a gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. And then, after weeks of relentless searching, I found it. An old newspaper article, tucked away in a forgotten file in the library's basement. It was a small, yellowed clipping, barely legible, but the headline caught my eye: "Local man vanishes without a trace." My heart started to pound in my chest. This was it, I knew it. The article told the story of a family who had lived in the cabin in the 1950s. A husband, a wife, and a young daughter. They were described as a quiet, unassuming family who kept to themselves. The article reported that the husband, a man named Thomas Ashton, had disappeared without a trace one day. He had gone for a walk in the woods and never returned. The police had conducted an extensive search, but found no sign of him. The case went cold and eventually was relegated to the unsolved mysteries file. The article stated the wife, Sarah Ashton, was the primary suspect, but could not be charged for the crime, as there was no evidence of foul play. My blood ran cold. I read on, my hands trembling as I deciphered the faded print. The wife, Sarah, had remarried a few years later and eventually sold the cabin. It had passed through several owners since then, each staying only a short time before selling again. The whispers of Sarah's potential crime were still talked about. The article ended with a chilling quote from a neighbor, a farmer who lived down the road. "That place has a darkness about it," he said. "I wouldn't live there if you paid me. There's something unsettling about that cabin. It feels like it's holding onto a secret." I closed the newspaper, my mind reeling. It was just a story, an old, unsolved mystery. But it resonated with me, with the strange occurrences I'd been experiencing, with the pervasive sense of unease that had settled over the cabin. The scratching noises, the muddy footprints, the metallic smell, it all seemed to fit together, like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and a spooky old newspaper article. But the primal part of me knew that something was wrong, that the cabin was more than just a dilapidated old building. It was a place haunted by the past, a place where something terrible had happened. And now, it felt like that something was reaching out to me, trying to tell me its story. As I turned off the computer and left the library, I was terrified. Armed with the chilling details of the Ashton case, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a real-life ghost story. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and whispers in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the trees sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to find something concrete, something tangible to either confirm or debunk my growing fears. I couldn't live like this, suspended in a state of constant dread. I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly, to search every nook and cranny for any sign of what might have happened to Thomas Ashton. I started with the obvious places. I ripped up the loose floorboard under the rug in the living room, expecting to find a hidden stash of money or perhaps a dusty old diary. But all I found was dirt, dust, and the skeletal remains of a long-deceased mouse. Disappointment washed over me, quickly replaced by a renewed determination. I meticulously searched the walls for any sign of the scratching sound, tapping on every panel, listening for hollow spots. I crawled into the cramped attic, choking on dust and cobwebs, but found nothing but old boxes filled with forgotten junk. I even ventured down into the dark, damp cellar, armed with a flashlight and a hefty dose of courage, but the only things I found were spiders, mildew, and the lingering smell of decay. Days turned into nights as my obsession grew. I became consumed by the search, neglecting my work, my friends, and my basic hygiene. I was a woman possessed, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth. Then, one afternoon, while I was cleaning out the old wood stove in the kitchen, I noticed something strange. I had been shoveling out the accumulated ashes, my mind preoccupied with the Ashton case, when my shovel scraped against something hard. It was a small metal plate, hidden behind a thick layer of soot and grime. It was flush with the wall, easy to miss. I pried at it with a screwdriver, my heart pounding in my chest. The metal was old and corroded, but it eventually gave way, revealing a narrow opening in the brickwork. It was too small to be a ventilation shaft, too hidden to be anything accidental. This had to be deliberate. Inside the opening, I found a small, tarnished metal box. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it was heavy, surprisingly so. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, the metal cold against my skin. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I had to lean against the wall for support. This was it, I thought. This was the key. With shaking fingers, I carefully opened the box. The hinges creaked in protest, releasing a musty odor that sent a shiver down my spine. Inside the box was a collection of items. A faded photograph of a young woman with haunted eyes, her face etched with sadness and despair. It was Sarah Ashton, the wife who had been suspected of murdering her husband. A tarnished wedding ring, its gold dulled by time and neglect. It was engraved with the initials TA and SA and a small folded piece of paper, its edges frayed and yellowed. I unfolded the paper carefully, my breath held captive in my chest. On it, written in a shaky hand, was a single word, help. And written below that in smaller, even more shaky script, was a string of numbers. Latitude and longitude coordinates. I stared at the coordinates, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. A desperate plea for help, hidden away for decades. A secret message, waiting to be discovered. This wasn't just a ghost story anymore. This was something real, something tangible, something that demanded to be investigated. A rush of adrenaline surged through me, washing away the fear and replacing it with a burning sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. This was the beginning of a new chapter, the chapter where justice was served. My mind raced, the coordinates burning in my memory. They were close, I knew it. I immediately grabbed my phone and punched the numbers into a GPS app. The location popped up, a wooded area about 10 miles from the cabin, marked as unverified landmark. My heart pounded. It had to be something significant, something the locals hadn't bothered to map or record. I grabbed my keys, a flashlight, and the tarnished metal box, and practically sprinted out of the cabin. The drive was agonizingly slow, the dirt roads bumpy and treacherous. Every shadow seemed to hold a menacing figure. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. But the burning desire to uncover the truth kept me going. I parked my car on the side of a rarely used road and started hiking into the dense forest, following the GPS signal on my phone. The woods were eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around me like specters. As I continued through the dense woodland, I stumbled into an overgrown field. After what felt like an eternity, I found it. A decrepit, half-collapsed stone well, almost completely hidden by the undergrowth. It was as if the forest itself was trying to conceal it, to bury it forever. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. This was it. This was where Thomas Ashton's story ended. I approached the well cautiously, peering over the crumbling stone lip. The well was dry, long abandoned. But something glinted at the bottom. I knew it was there, and a dark fear took over me. I knew I had to get down there. I took a deep breath and checked the sides of the wall. Thankfully, it was not too deep, and with some steady movements, I started to climb down the inside of the well. The air grew colder and damper as I descended. I reached the bottom, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. Not a body, not bones, not anything overtly gruesome as I had imagined. Instead, neatly tucked against the far wall, was a weathered leather suitcase, the kind someone might take on a long train journey. Relief, disbelief, and a surge of adrenaline flooded through me. If there was no body, then what was this? Carefully, I maneuvered myself, grabbing the suitcase, and began the arduous climb back to the surface, my muscles screaming in protest. Back at the cabin, under the harsh glare of the kitchen light, I finally opened the suitcase. It was filled with documents, bank statements, legal papers, deeds, and letters, all meticulously organized, and all dated from the 1950s. As I sifted through the papers, a shocking story began to unfold. Thomas Ashton wasn't a victim of foul play. He was a crook, a fraudster. He had been embezzling money from his employer, a local bank. He had stashed the stolen funds in a series of secret accounts, planning to disappear and start a new life. Sarah Ashton knew about his plans. She knew about the stolen money, but she also knew that he intended to leave her and their daughter behind, penniless. The letters revealed a desperate plea from Sarah to Thomas, begging him to reconsider, to share the money, to not abandon them. But Thomas was unmoved. His only concern was his own freedom and fortune. Sarah had confronted him on the night he was supposed to leave, and in a moment of rage and despair, she pushed him, causing him to strike his head and die. She hadn't planned to kill him, but in a panic, she had hidden his body at the bottom of the well. The suitcase contained all the evidence to prove Thomas's crimes, as well as Sarah's confession. But there was more to this than the events of the past. Some of the more recent documentation related to Ethan and Brittany. It turns out that Ethan's struggles were a complete fabrication. Brittany had discovered the existence of Thomas Ashton's secret accounts, hidden away in a Swiss bank. She had persuaded Ethan to concoct a sob story about financial hardship, knowing that my parents would be eager to help, especially if it meant dispossessing me of my house. Their plan was to use my house as collateral to secure a loan, then use that money to access the hidden fortune. They intended to leave the country and start a new life, leaving me and my parents in the dust. I was furious. Everything was so meticulously planned, so calculatedly cruel. Armed with the evidence of Thomas Ashton's embezzlement and Ethan and Brittany's despicable scheme, I drove straight to my parents' house. I dumped the suitcase on the kitchen table, spreading out the documents before their shocked eyes. "Do you see now?" I shouted, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. "This is who you've been favoring. This is who you think is so much better than me. They were manipulating you, using you, and they were going to leave you with nothing." My parents were speechless, their faces pale with disbelief and shame. They had been so blinded by their favoritism that they couldn't see the truth, even when it was staring them in the face. I immediately contacted the authorities, providing them with all the evidence I had gathered. The investigation was swift and decisive. The police exhumed Thomas Ashton's remains from the well, confirming Sarah Ashton's long-hidden confession. Ethan and Brittany's scheme unraveled quickly. They were arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. The bank seized their assets, including my house. A few weeks later, Ethan and Brittany were living in a small apartment across town, their dreams of wealth and luxury shattered. My parents were heartbroken, their reputation tarnished. As for me, I moved back into my house, its walls no longer whispering with secrets and sadness. The darkness had been lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. I have not spoken to them since, and I am better off for it. I sold the cabin and took myself on a long vacation. The truth was finally out. And while the experience had been terrifying and traumatic, it had also made me stronger, more resilient, and more determined to live my life on my own terms. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, a warrior who had finally found her voice. And most importantly, I finally understood that my worth wasn't defined by my parents' approval, but by my own strength and resilience. I was free.